Welcome to the Swine Health Black Belt Podcast, the latest swine health research digested for you. My name is Dr. 𝗘𝗃𝗀𝗁. I'm the host of the podcast, and joining me is one of the best and brightest veterinarians in the swine industry. Dr. Paul Yeske, a veterinarian with Swine Vet Center, is here to join us today to talk about Mycoplasma elimination. Paul, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, it's my pleasure to be with you this afternoon and to share some of our information.
Paul, I've had the pleasure of working with you for many years. If there is a chance anybody in the pig industry doesn't know you yet, why don't you give a brief background on yourself and your role there at Swine Vet Center?
Sure. My job at Swine Vet Center is a swine veterinarian, and I've specialized in disease elimination, particularly 𝗘𝘅𝗽𝗲𝗀𝘁, Mycoplasma, PED. So I've done a little bit of everything, but I've spent a lot of time on Mycoplasma. And what I'd like to do this afternoon is kind of share with you some little different twist on the Mycoplasma elimination.
Paul, you said something at a farm one time that I'll always remember. You know, we fight 𝗘𝘅𝗽𝗀𝗀𝘁, we fight Mycoplasma, we fight flu in those finishing pigs. Mycoplasma is probably the most consistent one that we can eliminate. And I know you're here to talk to us about elimination and been working on it for years. So I'll turn it over to you. What's the latest and greatest ideas you've got for eliminating Mycoplasma?
You bet. No, I'd be happy to share. And like I said, what we tried here on this particular case study or farm was to try a little different approach. And so we've tried some whole herd medication programs, and they've had somewhat limited success when we don't follow it with a herd closure. So, and typically we've done the medication programs where we do those at the back end of the closure. So you've got that 240 days of time frame while you're in the closure that you're still generating positive pigs, or somewhere between positive and negative pigs, and so still getting some of the losses. And so the thought process was, can we shorten that process? And we'd done it with some different studies where we'd looked at using an injectable where we injected all the sows and the piglets, and those were successful. And so the question was, can we do it using the water medication route? And work with the folks at Elanco. They helped to sponsor this project, and we looked at using 𝗕𝗅𝗽𝗲𝗁𝗄𝐴𝐶 in the water, and we looked at using that as our medication program. What we started out with was we had a herd that had an acute outbreak. They'd been a real stable herd, and then all of a sudden destabilized as they changed their gilt source, and then became active infection. We went through and we standardized the exposure to all the animals. We did a fogging of the herd and the GDU, and then we considered that as our day zero after we confirmed that the animals were positive. And then we closed the herd for the 240-day period. But instead of waiting to the end to do the medication, we started up front, and we did 7 days of the 𝗕𝗅𝗽𝗀𝗁𝗄𝐴𝐶, took 7 days off, and then we did an additional 7 days of 𝗕𝗅𝗪 in the water. At the same time we started the water medication, we started treating the piglets at birth with Baytril injection. And then at 14 days, we retreated those piglets for a period of 4 weeks. And then we started monitoring that flow downstream after we'd completed that process. And so, again, it's very similar to what we would have done historically at the back end of a closure. We just did it at the front end of the closure to try and pick up that performance gain through the time frame. And the beauty of this design is you can have a plan B. If things don't go as you expect, you're in the herd closure, you can come back and do additional medication at the back end if the diagnostics tell you that's necessary. So it's got some flexibility to it in the fact that I can try and get the best of the best from the front and have negative pigs that time frame. But if it's not successful, I have an opportunity to still salvage the project and get value. And so that's the thought process here. We followed this herd through. And fortunately, as we followed this herd through over time, what we saw is once we got through that period of medication and we started following those pigs through the system, that we were indeed able to produce negative pigs through the growth finish phase. And we tested those pigs at the end of finishing to confirm their status. And we did that using tracheal swabs. We did tracheal swabs, of course, self-harm to confirm that we got everything exposed in the beginning. And then we did that in the various finishing sites as we went on through the process. And so we did see, and we went back and we looked at some records for the farm. And one of the challenges here is when you do these sort of look back studies is your before and after. So, there's a lot of things that can change before and after, but what we did see was we did see a slight reduction in pre-weaning mortality. I wouldn't necessarily say I've seen that before. It was about 0.5%, which isn't big and may or may not be significant. And we saw a reduction in the nursery by a couple tenths. And I wouldn't expect a lot of mortality change in the nursery. And as we looked at the finishing, we dropped that by about 3% on the mortality, and we saw a better average daily gain and better feed efficiency, which are probably the things that pay for it the most and the best. So again, not only we saw some mortality differences, but we also saw that average daily gain feed efficiency improvement. And as we got to the end of the study, we went in and we looked at the sow herd using tracheal swabs, and we followed some of those early groups through the finisher using the tracheal swabs, and everything was testing negative through the study. And so it certainly felt very good that we were successful. The producer, however, decided at the end to have a belt, suspenders, and a belt, and decided to run some CTC at the back end just to give themselves better opportunity to be successful at the end. Again, not a huge cost on the back end because we ran it through the feed and just did it as an insurance policy. But the herd continues now. We're quite a ways down the road and continues to be negative, continues to test negative, and the pigs continue to be performing well. So again, I think as we talk about Mycoplasma eliminations, there's lots of different protocols that are out there. I've done many different protocols, and I'm sure as we go into the future, there's going to be more. But this one still takes advantage of some of those basics. We got everybody exposed. We had a solid day 0. And we used the closure, the herd closure, the 240 days. Again, one of the things that have been time tested over the course of time. And then we did a medication program, but here we did it up front, and it appears that it made good success. One of the other questions that I oftentimes get from people is, well, I can get the self-harm done, and I get all these negative pigs and I put them in a pig dense area. What's my likelihood that these pigs are going to stay negative and I'm really going to get the benefits you're talking about? And it's a fair question. We were able to do a study here a few years ago. It's been a while back now, but where we looked at 100 different finishing sites. And when we went in and looked at those sites, we looked at 50 of them in the summer and 50 of them in the winter, just so we could see any seasonal patterns. If there were seasonal patterns, and only 6% of those sites became infected. And these were in very pig dense area in southwest Minnesota, northwest Iowa. So definitely a lot of pigs in the area. So it wasn't a shortage of local exposure. So with that being said, I think, that shows we've got a good opportunity there. And I think if you look at it over time from the economics, and I did some work with Daniel Linares, and I think $5 is probably a pretty good number when we talk about what's that worth, and so I think there's certainly some advantages here for herds when you got the opportunity, or if something comes up. If you're in a PRRS closure, it's certainly easy to piggyback on a myco closure, and I think we've got a number of clients that have gone on and just done Mycoplasma on its own. Just to go ahead and pick that up as well. So I guess with that, Clayton, I'll see if you got any questions.
Absolutely. 𝗕𝗰𝗙𝗴𝗿𝗂𝗁 specifically, water medication. We typically think of water medications with finishers, but not sow farms. Any practical tips, Paul, for somebody who's listening and says, yep, I buy it, I want to do it, but I do not have my farm plumbed for water medication today?
Yep, and that is one of the challenges. I think probably the most important thing is you may want to come in and do what's we've seen work the best is if you have a medicator for the gestation barn, separate water line, ideally a separate source and water line for gestation and one for lactation, and then one of the high volume medicators, the 44 gallon per minute or higher. Again, the traditional that you'd use in a finishing barn is either going to slow down the water coming through the system and restrict the access. But those high volume medicators have made it work well. And then a 30 or 50, depending upon farm size, but a 30 or 50 gallon garbage can is your stock reservoir. And so those would be the short list of things you can do to make it a little bit easier. But again, oftentimes it's not that hard to jump in. Some farms are a little more complicated because particularly as we think about this time of the year, the 𝗕𝗰𝗽𝗀𝗃 line may come out of that. And if you can jump into the line after where the cool cells come out, and some of those sort of things can make it a little bit less expensive and less concerns with that. But each farm kind of has their own unique plumbing issues to deal with, but it's certainly a fair question.
Sounds like it's very doable. May take some creative application with plumbing, but very doable.
Absolutely.
You talked, Paul, about monitoring downstream, and I think that's one of the toughest parts about mycoplasma elimination is declaring success in the right samples. Can you give us a little detail on, in those downstream tracheal swabs, how many swabs per site, what age do you target on those finishing pigs, and about how many sites do you do in a row in that flow before you start to get comfortable to say, we know one way or the other?
Yeah, and I don't know if we went to the full statistical number, or I should say, I know we didn't. To get to the full statistical number, because you're looking for a very, very low prevalence, you probably got to do 250 to 500 samples. What we did in this case is we did about 4 sites, and we did about 60 samples per site. And we did it right before topping in the finisher. For me, if you're going to test and see if mycoplasma, since it's a late breaking disease, you need to be testing late finishing. It's great to get a negative earlier, but it probably doesn't mean anything. And or it means less. It means you're successful up to that point, but until you get through the entire finishing phase, it's probably not worthwhile. And so we did these at the end of finishing, and so we had to wait a while to get those first results back. And we also went in and tested, I believe we did 60 of the youngest gilts that were exposed. We figured those animals had the greatest risk. And I think if you look at the statistical charts, if you want to get down to 1% to 2% prevalence, you really should be testing like 256 or something like that.
Yeah.
We had limitations on budget for diagnostics.
Budgets, back, snares,
all the above.
Yeah, easier said than done with the testing. It's just not always practical to get the samples that you want. Paul, thank you very much for coming on. Tremendous information. I would add in for the audience, Paul, I think your name's on this paper, but Sam Holst with your team wrote an amazing review paper several years back in I think JSHAP on mycoplasma elimination. So I would encourage the audience, if you're interested in mycoplasma elimination and need some foundational building blocks of how to get started with it, check out Sam Holst's research paper. It is a wonderful overview of all the knowledge that at least was out there when that paper was published a few years back. Paul, it's been a pleasure to have you. Thanks for coming on the show. And to our audience, thanks for listening to the Swine Health Black Belt podcast. Check us out on our website, swinehealthblackbelt.com. And subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss out on our episode. Paul, it's been a pleasure to have you on. Thanks for this, and thanks for everything you do for the industry.
Thanks a lot. Pleasure to be here.
All right. Have a great rest of your day, everybody.